In 1995, a man named Fraser Heston published a memoir about his father. Fraser was 40 years old when the book came out. He had grown up in the house on Coldwater Canyon in Beverly Hills that his father had built, and that his father had inhabited with the specific quality of deliberate, constructed authority that everything about Charlton Heston was constructed with. The house itself was a statement, as everything about Charlton Heston was a statement about the kind of man he intended to be seen as, and the kind of life that kind of man was supposed to live. The book was not a hostile account. Fraser Heston loved his father. He said so in the book and in the interviews that accompanied the book and in the subsequent years when the question of his relationship to his father came up, which it continued to come up because the father was famous and the father's fame produced the specific situation of the child of the famous, which is that the relationship to the parent is always partly a relationship to the parent's public version, and that the two versions are not always the same. What the book said, in the specific oblique way that children of famous parents say difficult things about those parents, when the parents are still alive, and when the children still love them, and when the difficulty is real and needs to be said but cannot be said with the full directness that it might be said with, if the parent were gone and the love were not present, was that the man Fraser Heston had grown up with was not entirely the man that the world knew from the films and the speeches and the public positions and the specific sculpted image of Charlton Heston as the embodiment of a certain kind of American moral seriousness. The world knew the Moses. The world knew the Ben-Hur. The world knew the president of the National Rifle Association and the civil rights marcher and the man who had stood at the podium at 1,000 events and delivered with the voice that God had given him and that he had spent 60 years learning to deploy with maximum effect, the specific kind of authoritative American rhetoric that sounds like it is coming from somewhere larger than a single person. Fraser knew the man who came home. Tonight, my friend, I want to tell you about both men. Not because the second man cancels the first, and not because what Fraser and others have said about the private Charlton Heston should be used to dismiss what the public Charlton Heston actually did and actually stood for. But because the gap between the two men, the gap between the man on the podium and the man in the house on Coldwater Canyon, is real and documented and tells us something important about what it costs a person to build and maintain an image of moral authority across 60 years, and what the building and maintaining of it does to the people who are required to live in its shadow. Come with me. We are going back to Evanston, Illinois, in the year 1923, to a family that was not prosperous and was not stable in the ways that stability is most needed. John Charles Carter was born on the 4th of October, 1923, in Evanston, Illinois. He would become Charlton Heston, the name taken from his mother's family name and his stepfather's, but he began as John Charles Carter, the son of Russell Whitford Carter, a lumber mill operator, and Lilla Charlton Carter, a woman whose life was about to require of her the specific kind of reconstruction that failed marriages in the early 20th century required of the women who had been in them. His parents divorced when he was 10 years old. The divorce was not dramatic in its external presentation. It was, by the accounts available, the dissolution of a marriage that had not been working for years in ways that the people involved had managed to maintain a surface over, and that the divorce formalized rather than created. The father was not a presence in the subsequent years. He left the family geography in the specific way of fathers in failed marriages of that era, who left the immediate circumstances of the marriage and receded from the child's daily life into the specific status of the father who is elsewhere. His mother remarried. Chester Heston was a man of stable, reliable character, whose qualities were those of a good stepfather in the specific practical sense. He was present, he was providing, he was not unkind. He was not the same as a father, in the way that stepfathers are not the same as fathers regardless of their specific qualities. and the boy who took his stepfather's name, becoming Charlton Heston rather than John Carter, understood this distinction with the specific clarity of a child who has already learned what the original father's departure means and who knows that the new arrangement is an arrangement rather than the original thing. He was raised in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, in St. Helens, where the family moved when he was a child. In the specific environment of small-town Midwestern life in the 1930s that produced, in the people who grew up in it, a particular quality of values and of the relationship to those values. The specific Midwestern Protestant seriousness about work and discipline, and the requirement that a man demonstrate his worth through the things he builds and the positions he takes, and the consistency with which he maintains those positions under pressure. He performed in his high school. He was good at it from the beginning, with the specific quality of natural authority on a stage that distinguishes the people who were born to occupy stages from the people who learn to occupy them. He went to Northwestern University on a scholarship, and at Northwestern he met Lydia Clark, who was a drama student and who was intelligent and serious and who would marry him in 1944 and who would remain married to him for 64 years until his death in 2008. The marriage to Lydia is the central fact of his domestic life across 64 years, and I want to be clear about what that fact means and what it does not mean. It means that the marriage endured. It means that the two people who entered it in 1944 maintained it through the full range of what 64 years of a marriage produces until the death ended it. That is a real achievement and a genuine fact about who he was in the most private domestic sense. It does not mean that the marriage was simple, or that it was uncomplicated, or that the endurance of it was not itself a form of cost for the person who endured alongside him. The accounts of people who knew the family across those 64 years suggest a marriage that was real and that contained genuine love, and that also contained, in the domestic space that the marriage occupied, the specific challenge of being the person who shared a house with Charlton Heston. He served in the Army Air Forces during the Second World War. He was a B-25 bombardier, and he served in the Aleutian Islands, which is a theater of the war that the mythology of the Second World War does not always foreground, but that was genuinely difficult and genuinely demanding in the way of all combat theaters. He came back from the war with the specific quality of returned veteran that the post-war decades would require to find its place in a civilian world that had continued without the people who had been fighting. And he came back with the specific additional quality of a man who had developed, during the war years, a clearer understanding of what he was capable of and what he intended to be capable of. He went to New York. He worked in theater and in early television, which in the late 1940s was the medium that was expanding fast enough to absorb the supply of young men with presence and ambition and the specific qualities that the new medium was discovering it needed. He was noticed. The noticing produced the screen test that produced the Hollywood contract that produced the career. He arrived in Hollywood in the early 1950s, and the studio system received him with the specific assessment that the studio system applied to new arrivals, whose qualities were apparent. He was physically extraordinary in a way that the historical epic, which was the dominant commercial genre of the early 1950s, specifically required, and he was professionally serious in a way that the directors who were making those epics specifically valued. The Ten Commandments came in 1956. Cecil B. DeMille directed it, and DeMille understood what he had in Charlton Heston with the clarity of a director who had been making historical epics for 30 years, and who recognized immediately that the face and the voice and the quality of physical authority that Charlton Heston brought to a role were the exact combination that Moses required. Not any Moses, but the specific Moses that the film needed. The Moses who is capable of carrying the moral weight of the narrative, who can stand at the Red Sea and raise his staff and make the audience believe, in the specific way that cinema makes audiences believe things, that what is happening in front of them is real. He made the film. The film was extraordinary. It remains one of the most commercially successful films in the history of American cinema and one of the most culturally significant films in the specific way that films, which define a generation's visual understanding of a biblical story, are culturally significant. And the Moses that the film produced, the image of Charlton Heston as Moses, the face and the voice and the physical presence organized into the embodiment of a man who speaks for God. That image became, across the subsequent decades, inseparable from the public understanding of who Charlton Heston was. Which is to say, the man who played Moses became, in the public understanding, Moses. Not literally, not in the sense that the audience was confused about the nature of cinema, but in the sense that the qualities that the role required and that he brought to it, the moral authority, the unwillingness to compromise, the specific quality of a man who has decided what is right and who is prepared to face any consequence, rather than deviate from that decision. Those qualities became attached to the actor in the public mind in a way that the subsequent decades of his public life confirmed and extended. He won the Academy Award for Best Actor in 1959 for Ben-Hur. The film is another one of the defining epics of the era, another film in which the physical authority and the quality of moral seriousness that Heston brought to the role were the exact qualities the role required. The chariot race remains one of the most technically accomplished sequences in the history of cinema, and the presence of Charlton Heston in the chariot, the specific total physical commitment he brought to what was genuinely dangerous work, is central to what makes the sequence what it is. He was, in the late 1950s and into the 1960s, the biggest star in Hollywood for a specific category of film. Not the biggest star overall. The commercial landscape was more varied than that. But for the historical epic, for the film that required a man who could occupy a frame in a manner that the frame required occupying, with a quality of presence that was not performed, but simply was, he was without equal. He marched on Washington in 1963. He was there at the March on Washington, in the crowd and on the platform, present for the specific historic event that the civil rights movement produced on that August afternoon, and that the subsequent decades have confirmed as one of the defining moments of 20th century American history. He was not a passive presence. He had been involved in civil rights advocacy before the march, and he was committed to what the march represented in a way that his subsequent critics, when his politics shifted dramatically in the direction that they shifted, have often used to indict the later positions rather than to credit the earlier ones. The credit is real. In 1963, in Hollywood, marching for civil rights was not the commercially neutral choice that it would become in subsequent decades when the moral weight of the civil rights movement was sufficiently established that supporting it cost nothing. In 1963, it cost something, and Charlton Heston paid the cost, and the payment was genuine. And yet, Fraser Heston, in his book, described a father who was a different person at home than the person who stood on stages and delivered the speeches and carried the banners. The difference was not the ordinary difference between public and private versions of oneself that everyone maintains. It was, by Fraser's account and by the accounts of others who spent time in the domestic environment of the house on Coldwater Canyon, a difference of a more specific and more troubling kind. He was controlling. He was controlling in the way of a man who has organized his entire public identity around the performance of moral authority and who requires the domestic environment to reflect and confirm that authority in ways that the people in the domestic environment are not always able to provide. He had expectations about how the house was run and how the family behaved and what was appropriate in the specific context of being Charlton Heston's family that were, by the accounts of people who experienced them, comprehensive and not easily deviated from. He was not warm in the private sense. The warmth that the public saw, the specific quality of accessible humanity that the Moses and the Ben-Hur and the public speeches communicated to the audiences who received them, was a quality that the domestic environment did not consistently replicate. The man who came home was not always the man who had been on the stage, in the way that the man on the stage was warm and present and apparently fully engaged with the people around him. The man who came home was often the man who had spent the day performing those qualities and who arrived in the domestic space without the performance, and in whom the absence of the performance revealed something that was harder and more demanding and less accessible than the performance had suggested. Fraser has said that he spent much of his childhood trying to be what his father needed him to be, rather than what he was. He has said this with the care of a son who loves his father and who is trying to describe something true without performing a grievance. And the care itself is telling. The care of a person who understands that the full truth of what he experienced would be harder on his father's memory than the partial truth he is willing to offer. Lydia managed it. This is the other thing that the 64-year marriage contains, alongside the love and the endurance. The specific work of managing a domestic environment organized around a man who required it to reflect his sense of himself and who was not always easy to live with in the way of men who require their domestic environments to reflect their sense of themselves and who are not always easy to live with. She was a woman of intelligence and of the specific patient competence that the management required. She maintained the house and managed the children and sustained the marriage across 64 years in ways that the public understanding of Charlton Heston as the moral patriarch of the American right does not always account for, because the public understanding is organized around him and not around the person who made the house he inhabited livable. The politics shifted. This is the fact about Charlton Heston that his biographers and his critics and the people who admired him and the people who did not have spent the most time on. And it deserves honest treatment rather than the partisan treatment that most of the available accounts have given it. He was, through the 1960s, a man whose public political positions were on the liberal side of the American spectrum: the civil rights advocacy, the opposition to the Vietnam War, the support for Robert Kennedy. He was, by the 1980s and into the 1990s, a man whose public political positions were on the conservative side of the American spectrum. The support for Ronald Reagan, the presidency of the NRA, the positions on gun rights and cultural conservatism that made him, in the final decades of his public life, one of the most prominent figures of the American right. The shift has been described variously as a genuine evolution of political views in response to the events of the intervening years, as an opportunistic repositioning in response to the shifting commercial and cultural landscape of Hollywood in the post-1960s period, and as the expression of a deeper and more stable set of values that had always been present and that the political context of the 1960s had temporarily aligned with liberal positions, and that the political context of the 1980s aligned with conservative ones. I am not going to tell you which of those accounts is correct, because the evidence does not allow a clean determination, and because the attempt to provide one would require me to be more confident about the interior motivations of another person than the available evidence warrants. What I will tell you is that the shift was real, and that it was consequential, and that the man who marched in Washington in 1963 and the man who held up a rifle at an NRA convention in 2000 and said it would be taken from him over his cold dead hands were the same person, and that the sameness of the person is part of the story rather than a paradox that the story needs to resolve. The NRA presidency. He became president of the National Rifle Association in 1998 at the age of 74. He served for 5 years. He was, during those 5 years, the most visible and the most rhetorically effective spokesman the organization had ever had, because the voice and the authority and the specific quality of moral seriousness that had made Moses and Ben-Hur were available for the advocacy, and he deployed them with the total commitment he brought to all his professional performances. He held the rifle above his head. He said the words. The words went into the public record and into the cultural memory of the period, with the force that words delivered by that voice, with that physical authority, tend to have. And they remain there, available for people to do with them whatever they need to do with them depending on their own position on the questions the words were addressing. The Alzheimer's diagnosis came in 2002. He announced it publicly in a videotaped statement that he delivered with the specific quality of dignity and composure and the willingness to face directly the thing that was being faced that had always characterized his public self. He said that he had been diagnosed with symptoms consistent with Alzheimer's disease. He said he intended to face the diagnosis with the courage that his faith and his values provided him. He said his wife, Lydia, was with him. The statement was, as all of his public statements were, carefully crafted and carefully delivered. And it was also genuine in a way that distinguished it from the purely managed statements of public figures announcing medical difficulties. He was genuinely facing something. He was genuinely bringing to the facing of it the resources that the previous 80 years had given him. And the facing of it was, in the years that followed the announcement, a facing of a particular difficulty. Not the difficulty of a man who does not have the resources to face it, but the difficulty of a man whose specific form of identity is organized around the use of his mind and his voice and his authority, and who is now losing access to all three in the specific, irreversible way of Alzheimer's. Lydia managed it. The family managed it. The house on Coldwater Canyon became the place where Charlton Heston spent his final years in the way of people with Alzheimer's, in the final stages, present in the physical sense, and progressively absent in the sense of being the person who had occupied the physical presence. He died on the 5th of April, 2008. He was 84 years old. Lydia was with him. Fraser was with him. The family was around him in the way of families, around a man who is dying and who has been a specific, dominant presence in their lives for the duration of their existence, and who is now leaving and who leaves behind not only the grief of the loss, but the specific complexity of what the presence had been across the decades it had occupied. The tributes were what the tributes of a man of his public standing always are: extensive, organized around the public version, focused on the films and the speeches and the political legacy. The people who loved him spoke. The people who disagreed with him noted the disagreement and credited what deserved crediting. The full complexity of who he was, the Moses and the man who terrified his family, the civil rights marcher and the NRA president, the public warmth and the private demands, did not fit in any single tribute and was not going to fit. Now, my friend, I want to sit with you in the specific kind of reflection that Charlton Heston's story requires. He was, genuinely and without qualification, one of the finest physical presences that American cinema ever produced. The Ten Commandments and Ben-Hur are films that would not exist in the form they exist without what he brought to them. And the form they exist in is a form of genuine artistic achievement that the passing decades have not diminished. The civil rights advocacy was real and came at a cost. The voice was extraordinary, literally extraordinary, in the sense of being outside the ordinary range of what human voices are. And he used it across 60 years in the service of the performances and the causes he believed in, with the total commitment that everything about him was organized around total commitment. He was also a man who was difficult to live with in ways that the public version of him did not suggest. A man whose children felt the weight of his expectations in ways that their love for him required them to manage carefully in describing. A man whose wife spent 64 years in the specific patient work of managing the domestic environment of a man who required it to reflect his authority, and who did that work without complaint in the public sense, and with whatever she felt about it in the private sense that the private sense is owed. He was two men, as I said at the beginning. And the two men were not simply the good one and the bad one, the public one and the private one, the Moses and the man behind Moses. They were two aspects of the same person. A person whose gifts were real and whose demands were real, whose public warmth and private coldness were both genuine expressions of the same fundamental character, organized around the same central requirements of self and the same specific inability to be anything other than what he was. Whether the context was a film set or a political stage or a house on Coldwater Canyon, where the family was waiting for the man who had been performing all day to come home. He terrified his family in the specific way of men who require the domestic environment to mirror their sense of themselves. Not through violence, not through the dramatic forms of domestic difficulty that require legal intervention, but through the consistent, comprehensive expectation that the people around them will be what those people require, rather than what the people themselves are. That is a form of terror. It is a quieter form than the word usually implies. And it is a form that leaves marks that last longer than the obvious forms, because the people who carry it tend to do so in the specific, careful way of people who love the person who left the marks and who are not going to reduce the person to the marks. Fraser loved his father. Lydia loved her husband. The love was real and was not canceled by the difficulty, and was not made simple by the love. Both were true. Both were the same person. That is who Charlton Heston was. The Alzheimer's took him slowly. The voice was the last thing to go, in the way that the things we are built around are the last things to leave us. He was, in the final years, a man without the performances and without the speeches and without the films and without the public stages. And what remained when all of that was gone was a man and a woman and 64 years and whatever the 64 years had produced between them. Lydia was there, at the end, as at the beginning and through the whole of the middle. The house on Coldwater Canyon is still there. The films are still there. The speeches are in the record. The children carry what the children carry, in the way that children carry what the parents gave them and what the parents required of them, and the specific complexity of what it means to be the child of a man who is famous for a version of himself that is not the whole of himself. And the voice is gone. Sleep well, my friend. And the next time you see him on screen, the staff raised above the Red Sea, the chariot at full speed in the arena, the specific quality of a man who is fully occupying the frame and who is giving the camera the full force of everything he has. See both men. See the one who gave the world those images, who marched in Washington, who found in the public stages of 60 years the fullest expression of what he was capable of. And see the one who went home, who the family waited for, who the house on Coldwater Canyon contained in the private hours when the performance had ended, and the man who came through the door was simply the man, without the voice projected outward and without the frame to fill. He was both. America knew one, the family knew the other. The truth, as it always is somewhere that contains them both.